Our tale from Trench Crusade today takes us to the Levant front, near the city of New Antioch, and the story of Thomas Varga, a yeoman of the 11th Antioch Line Infantry, a former clerk from Esztergom who had traded a desk and an inkwell for a bolt-action rifle and a stretch of mud that the maps called Trench Sigma 9, and the men who lived in it called the Drain. The silence held. I woke to the sound of rats fighting over something in the dark, not an unusual alarm clock in the Drain, though less reliable than the 4 o'clock stand-to, which was announced by Corporal Dunne kicking the soles of our boots and saying the same thing he said every morning, which was, "Rise and shine, lads. Hell's not going to fight itself." He said it the way a man says good morning to a dog he does not particularly like, but is obliged to feed. Without enthusiasm, without variation. Every morning for the 14 months I had been in Trench Sigma 9, and for however many months before that, stretching back to whenever Seamus Dunne had first arrived from Erie with the Ranger detachment and been folded into our company like a piece of gristle into a sausage. I sat up on the fire step shelf that served as my bunk and scraped something off my neck that might have been a louse or might have been a piece of dried mud or might have been both, because in the Drain, these categories had ceased to be meaningfully distinct. The trench was 4 feet wide at this point and perhaps 7 feet deep, though depth was a relative concept in ground that had been shelled, dug, collapsed, shelled again, and rebuilt so many times that the walls were less earth than a compacted archaeology of previous disasters. I could see in the wan light of the kerosene lamp that hung from a nail driven into a support timber, layers of sandbag and corrugated iron and wood, and what appeared to be a section of church pew, all of it held together by mud, the color and consistency of wet cement. The air smelled of that mud, and of the latrine bucket that had not been emptied since yesterday, and of the particular sweetness that came from the dead who were buried in the trench walls, and who made their presence known whenever the rain softened the earth enough to expose a hand, or a boot, or, on one occasion that I preferred not to recall, a face. Luca was already awake. I could hear him before I saw him, a thin, persistent cough that had started 3 weeks ago as a tickle, and had progressed through stages of increasing severity to its current state, which was a sound like someone trying to start an engine that would not turn over. Private Luca Ferretti, 19 years old, from Naples, who had arrived in the Drain 6 months after me with the replacement draft, and who had, in the way of young soldiers, attached himself to our section with the desperate loyalty of a stray dog that has found people willing to feed it. He sat, hunched on an ammunition crate with a blanket around his shoulders, shivering in a way that had nothing to do with the cold, though the cold was considerable. A Levantine winter that felt like it had been imported from somewhere much further north and installed in the trench system as a deliberate cruelty. "You sound worse," I said. Luca looked at me with eyes that were too bright. The lamplight caught the sheen of sweat on his forehead. "I am fine," he said, which was what he always said, delivered with the automatic conviction of a man reciting a prayer he no longer believes but cannot stop saying. "You have a fever." "I am fine, Thomas." Nadia was cleaning her rifle. She did this every morning with a methodical attention that bordered on the devotional, stripping the bolt, wiping the barrel, oiling each component with the care of a watchmaker servicing a clock. Private Nadia Orlov, 27, from Novgorod, who spoke rarely and shot accurately, and who had, according to Corporal Dunne, more confirmed kills than any other yeoman in the company, a distinction she neither acknowledged nor appeared to value. She glanced at Luca, glanced at me, and said nothing, which was her way of saying everything. "The boy needs a medic," she said, which was apparently more than nothing. "The boy needs to shut up about being fine and report to the aid station," said Dunne, ducking under the traverse and stepping into our bay with 2 tin cups of something that was technically tea, in the same way that the drain was technically a fortified position. He handed one to me and one to Nadia, then looked at Luca. "Ferretti, you look like a corpse that hasn't had the good manners to lie down." "I am fine, Corporal." The silence held. "Aye, and I'm the Duke of New Antioch. Drink this." He produced a 3rd cup from somewhere inside his greatcoat and pressed it into Luca's hands. The boy wrapped his fingers around it, and I saw the tremor in them, a fine, continuous shaking that was not the cold. Trench fever. I had seen it enough times to know. The lice carried it. You could delouse your uniform by running a candle flame along the seams, and you could pick the creatures off your skin one by one in the ritual that occupied most of our leisure hours. And you could smear yourself with the greasy paste that the quartermaster issued in tins marked anti-vermin compound, blessed by the synod. And none of it mattered because the lice were infinite and patient, and they lived in the mud and the sandbags and the blankets and the very air, and eventually they found your blood, and what they put into it was worse than what they took out. I drank the tea. It tasted of rust and boiled leather, which was an improvement on yesterday's, which had tasted of rust and something I preferred not to identify. I ate my breakfast, which was a biscuit from a tin-marked field ration, Antioch Quartermaster Corps, and which had the consistency and approximate flavor of a roof tile. The biscuit was 6 months old, at least. Some men softened them in their tea. Some men broke them with the butts of their entrenching tools. I ate mine as they came, because the act of chewing something that resistant gave the jaw a purpose, and occupied the mind for the several minutes it took to reduce the thing to a paste that could be swallowed. The morning routine continued around me in the way it always did. Men stirring in their positions along the trench, the clink and scrape of equipment being checked, the low murmur of voices kept quiet by habit and by the knowledge that the heretic lines were close enough, in places, to hear a man sneeze. A private named Jurchek, 3 bays down, was picking lice from the seams of his shirt with the focused absorption of a jeweler examining stones. He held each one up to the lamplight before crushing it between his thumbnails with a small, satisfying click. He had been doing this for 20 minutes, and would do it for 20 more, and at the end of it, there would be no fewer lice on his shirt than when he started. But the ritual mattered. It was something you could control. In the drain, the list of things you could control was short enough to fit on a cigarette paper, and delousing was near the top of it. Stand to was a formality in our sector. The heretics had not attacked in strength for weeks, and the front had settled into the particular torpor of a war that neither side was currently willing or able to escalate. The great guns of New Antioch fired their daily salvos into the heretic rear areas, and the heretic artillery, the damned artillery witches with their infernal bombs that fell from nowhere and everywhere, replied in kind, and between these exchanges, the infantry sat in their respective holes and rotted. That was the word. Rotted. Not a metaphor, but a description. Everything in the drain was in a state of decomposition. The sandbags, the timber, the food, the men. The duckboards that lined the trench floor were spongy with moisture and broke under your weight if you stepped in the wrong place, plunging your boot into a soup of standing water and whatever the standing water contained, which was a question you learned not to ask. The corrugated iron sheets that formed the roof of the dugouts were rusted through in places, admitting a steady drip of brown water that smelled of iron and corruption. The food came up from the rear in containers that were supposed to be sealed but never quite were. so that by the time it reached us, the stew had acquired a film of mud, and the bread had the texture and flavor of the sandbags it was transported alongside. The rum ration was the only thing that arrived intact, which told you everything you needed to know about the Army's priorities. The silence held. Sergeant Horvat made his rounds at 6. Sergeant Milos Horvat, a man built like a wardrobe and possessed of a face that looked as if it had been assembled from spare parts left over after God had finished making other, more carefully considered faces. He was not a bad sergeant. He was not a good one. He was a sergeant, which meant he occupied the precise middle ground between the officers who made decisions and the men who suffered the consequences, and his primary function was to transmit the former to the latter with as little personal involvement as possible. Varga, Dunne, how many effective in your section? 4, said Dunne, if you count Ferretti, who by rights should be in the aid station. Horvat looked at Luca. He did not ask how the boy was feeling. Can he hold a rifle? He can hold a rifle the way a drowning man can hold a plank, said Dunne, which is to say with great determination and diminishing returns. He stays. We're short as it is. Battalion orders, all sections to full strength for the morning. Colonel Brandt is coming up to inspect. Colonel Brandt, said Dunne, in a tone that carried no inflection whatsoever, which was Dunne's way of conveying maximum contempt. The Colonel Brandt, who has not been forward of the reserve trenches since August? The same. And what, pray tell, is Colonel Brandt inspecting? The quality of our suffering. Our technique? Horvat did not smile. He did not smile. He moved on. Colonel Albrecht Brandt was the commanding officer of our battalion, which was the 3rd Battalion of the 11th Antioch Line Infantry, which was part of the new Antioch garrison forces defending the Levantine sector of the front. I had never spoken to Colonel Brandt. I had seen him twice, once at a muster parade in the rear area, where he had given a speech about duty and sacrifice that contained phrases I recognized from a pamphlet issued by the Office of the Propagation of Virtue, and once through a periscope when he had visited the communication trench behind our sector and had been photographed shaking hands with a trench pilgrim, an event that had required the trench pilgrim to be brought forward from his procession specifically for the purpose, and which had resulted in a photograph that appeared in the new Antioch Gazette under the headline, Brave Colonel Shares Fellowship with Holy Warrior at the Front. The trench pilgrim, in his iron caparot and gas mask, had looked as if he wanted to be somewhere else. So had the colonel. Colonel Brandt did not arrive at 8 as scheduled. He arrived at 11, by which time we had been standing in the trench in something approximating parade order for 3 hours, which, in the drain, meant standing in mud up to our ankles, with our equipment cleaned to a standard that would be destroyed within minutes of his departure. He came up the communication trench with an entourage that included 2 junior officers, an aide-de-camp, a church observer, one of the synod's watchers, his eyes blank and unblinking behind round spectacles, and inexplicably, a photographer. Brandt was a tall man with a thin mustache and the bearing of someone who had learned to stand up straight as a substitute for having a personality. He walked the trench line without touching the walls, which was a feat of balance that suggested either extensive practice or a deep aversion to mud. He paused at each section, received a report from the section leader, nodded, and moved on. When he reached our bay, Dunne stepped forward and delivered his report with the crisp efficiency of a man who had been giving reports to officers since before I could shave. Section 12, sir. 4 effectives, 1 casualty pending evacuation. He did not look at Luca, but the meaning was clear. Brandt looked at our bay. He looked at the fire step, the parapet, the sandbags, the drainage channel that was supposed to carry water to the sump, but which had silted up weeks ago. He looked at Nadia, who stood at attention with her rifle. He looked at Luca, who stood at attention with his rifle, and whose face was the color of tallow. "Fine," he said. "Fine work." I do not know what about our section struck him as fine. Dunne later suggested it was the way our lice had been arranged in parade formation, but Dunne suggested a lot of things. The silence held. Brandt moved on. His entourage followed. The photographer took a picture of the colonel standing next to one of the periscopes, framed against a backdrop of sandbags. It would look splendid in the Gazette. After the inspection, Horvat came back. His face was different now, harder, closed, the face of a man who has received orders he does not like and cannot refuse. "Section leaders, dugout, now." The dugout was a hole scooped into the trench wall and reinforced with timber and corrugated iron. 6 men, if none of them objected to intimacy. Horvat stood at the entrance with a map, a real map printed on linen, which meant this had come from battalion or higher, and he laid it on the ammunition crate that served as a table and looked at us and said, "We're going over the top, tomorrow, dawn." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. It pressed on the eardrums. I heard my own heartbeat and the distant thump of artillery and the ceaseless drip of water from the dugout roof and nothing else, because there was nothing else to hear. Going over the top. The 3 words that every man in the trenches understood as a possible death sentence, delivered in the same flat tone that Horvat used to announce the rum ration. "Objective is the heretic forward trench line here." He pointed at the map. "Designation Trench Kappa 3, 300 yards of open ground. We go at first light with the 1st and 2nd battalions on our flanks. 15 minutes of preparatory bombardment from the siege batteries. Then we advance." 300 yards, said Dunne. 300 yards, said Horvat. Across open ground. Across open ground. With the heretic wire between us and them. The bombardment will cut the wire. Dunne made a sound that might have been a laugh and might have been something else. The bombardment would cut the wire. This was what the officers said before every assault. And it was true in the same way that the drain was a fortified position, technically on paper, in the opinion of men who had never stood in front of heretic wire, and tried to get through it while a machine gun took apart the world around them. "What about the war wolf?" asked Corporal Resnick, who led Section 14. Horvat's face did not change, but something behind it did. "What about it?" Trench moles reported a war wolf in the heretic lines 2 days ago. Forward scouts confirmed movement consistent with an assault beast in Sector 7. That is the sector we are being asked to attack. Battalion is aware of the intelligence. And they are confident that the preparatory bombardment will neutralize the threat. The silence that followed this was different from the first one. Heavier. A war wolf was not a machine gun, or a mortar, or a trench full of heretic legionnaires. A war wolf was something else entirely. An abomination forged in the factories of hell, armored in plates stamped with maker's marks from the workshops of the damned, built to do one thing and to do it with a savagery that made conventional weapons look like toys. I had never seen one. I had seen what one left behind. 14 months ago, in the trench to our north, a war wolf had broken through the wire during a heretic counterattack. The section it hit had contained 12 men. What remained of them could have been collected in a bucket. "The bombardment," said Dunne slowly, as if explaining something to a child, "will not neutralize a war wolf. The bombardment would not neutralize a war wolf if you dropped the cathedral of the ascended Christ on it. A war wolf is not a thing that bombardments neutralize. Those are the orders, Corporal. Whose orders? Colonel Brandt's orders, approved by Brigade. Colonel Brandt, the man who was just here photographing himself next to a periscope. The same. Dunne looked at the map. He looked at the 300 yards of open ground between our trench and Trench Kappa 3. He looked at the wire markings and the machine gun positions and the notation that read, FWD Intel, Assault Beast, unconfirmed, in the careful handwriting of someone who had written it from the safety of a headquarters dugout 20 miles behind the line. Right, he said. Right, then. The silence held. We went back to our section. Nadia was waiting. She read our faces and did not ask what we had been told because she did not need to ask. Luca was asleep, or something close to it, slumped against the trench wall with his blanket pulled around him, shivering in his fever dreams. Tomorrow, I said. How bad? Said Nadia. 300 yards, open ground, wire, a possible war wolf. She considered this. I will need more ammunition. This was Nadia. The world was ending and she needed more ammunition. I could have kissed her for it. The rest of the day passed in preparation, which meant checking equipment, cleaning weapons, drawing extra ammunition and grenades from the quartermaster, and waiting. The waiting was the worst part. Not the fear. You could manage fear, compress it, push it down below the surface where it sat like a stone in your gut and did not interfere with the mechanical business of getting ready. The waiting was worse because it gave your mind time to work, and a mind with time was a dangerous thing in a trench on the day before an assault. I cleaned my rifle. It was a faithful pattern bolt action, manufactured in the armories of New Antioch, and it was the single most important object in my life, more important than my boots, my rations, my faith papers, or the small leather case of letters from home that I kept in my breast pocket. The rifle was my continuation. Everything else was comfort. I stripped it, oiled it, checked the action, loaded it, and set it beside me on the fire step. Then I wrote a letter. Not to anyone in particular. My parents were dead. My sister had married a man in Pressburg, and we had not corresponded in 3 years, and there was no one else who would care whether Thomas Varga survived the morning. I wrote it to no one, or to everyone, or to myself, and I said the things that men say when they think they might die, which are not the things you would expect. I did not write about God or about the Crusade or about the meaning of the war. I wrote about the sound of rain on the roof of my parents' house in Esztergom. I wrote about the taste of my mother's walnut cake. I wrote about a girl named Ava who had worked at the stationer's shop next to my office and who had smiled at me once in a way that I had thought about every day since, and whom I had never spoken to, because I had been 22 and stupid and afraid. And now I was 24 and less stupid and more afraid, and 3,000 miles away in a trench that smelled of death. I folded the letter and put it in my pocket. It would not be sent. It was not for sending. It was for writing. Dunne was doing something with a piece of wire and a tobacco tin, constructing what appeared to be a crude trap. I watched him for a while. Rat snare, he said without looking up. If I'm going to die tomorrow, I'll not do it with vermin eating my boots. Seamus. Thomas. Have you been over the top before? He looked at me. His face was weathered to the texture of old leather, creased and cracked by wind and cold, and the particular aging that combat inflicted, which was different from the aging of years, faster, deeper, concentrated in the eyes. Seamus Dunne had been a soldier for longer than Luca had been alive. He had fought in 3 sectors of the Levantine front before being assigned to our company, and before that, he had served with the Air Rangers in the defense of the White Cliffs Fortress. And before that, he had done things he did not talk about in places he did not name. He was the most competent man I had ever met, and the most tired. 7 times, he said. 7. Aye. And the secret, Thomas, is that it never gets easier, and anyone who tells you it does is either lying or dead, and frequently both. He twisted the wire into a loop. But the other secret is that it does not get harder either. It is what it is. You put your head above the parapet and you run and you try not to think and you keep running until you reach the other side or you don't. That is the whole of it. That is not reassuring. The silence held. I was not trying to reassure you. I was trying to inform you. Reassurance is for chaplains and mothers. I am neither. He set the rat snare on the duckboard. What I will tell you is this. Stay close to me. Keep your head down, and when I say move, you move. Do not stop for the wounded. Do not stop for anything. The wire is the killing ground. What you get through it as fast as you can or you die in it, and there is no third option. What about Luca? Dunne looked down the trench to where Luca was huddled in his blanket, coughing. The boy should not be going. I asked Horvat to pull him. He refused. Of course he refused. We are short-handed and the colonel needs his numbers to look right on the after-action report. 100 men looks better than 93 on the butcher's bill. Never mind that 7 of the 100 can barely stand. He paused. I will keep an eye on him. But Thomas, if it comes to it, if the choice is the boy or the section, I will choose the section. You understand that. I understand. Good. Now help me bait this trap. The bastards ate my bootlaces last night. Night came. The stand-down was at 9, which meant that half the section could sleep while the other half watched. Sleep was a generous word for what happened, more a shallow, fitful suspension of consciousness, interrupted by the cold and the lice and the intermittent crack of sniper fire, and the deeper percussion of artillery that rolled along the horizon like distant thunder. I lay on the fire step with my greatcoat pulled over me and my rifle beside me and my boots on, because you never took your boots off in the drain. If you took them off, you might not get them back on, because your feet would swell in the damp until they were the size and shape of something that belonged on a different animal entirely. Trench foot. Another of the drain's gifts. I had avoided it so far through a regimen of foot care that Dunne had taught me. Dry socks whenever possible, whale oil rubbed into the skin, elevation when you could manage it. Dunne attributed his own preserved feet to Irish stubbornness and the intercession of St. Patrick, who was a man who understood wet ground. Whether St. Patrick had opinions about foot rot I could not say, but Dunne's feet were in better condition than mine, and I was not inclined to argue with his theology. Luca's cough woke me at midnight, or perhaps it was the cough that had been continuous all along and my exhaustion had simply run out of the ability to ignore it. He sat propped against the wall of the trench, wrapped in both his blanket and mine, because I had given him mine without telling him because he would have refused it. His face was visible in the starlight, gray, sheened with sweat, the eyes bright with the particular luminescence of a body fighting something it was losing to. You should drink water, I said. I have been drinking water. You should drink more. If I drink any more water, I will drown from the inside, which would at least be a novel way to die in this place. I sat beside him. The night was still, or as still as the front ever was. the distant rumble of guns, the occasional flare rising from the heretic lines and drifting down on its parachute, casting the no-man's land in a white surgical light that threw every crater and wire tangle into sharp relief before fading to orange and then to dark. In that brief illumination, I could see the ground we would cross tomorrow. 300 yards of churned earth, cratered and scarred, the wire glinting like dew on a spider's web. Beyond it, the dark line of the heretic trench. "Thomas," said Luca. "Yes. I want you to send my letters home, if something happens." The silence held. He had a packet of them in his kit, letters from a girl named Vittoria, who lived in the rear area behind New Antioch in one of the supply towns that fed the front. Luca had met her when our company was rotated back for rest 3 months ago, and the correspondence that followed had been the kind of thing that made older soldiers either sentimental or cynical, depending on their temperament. Luca read her letters with a devotion that rivaled his devotion to the icon of St. Barbara that he carried in his breast pocket. Sometimes he read passages aloud, not the private parts, but the descriptions of daily life behind the lines, the small domestic details that seemed to belong to a different planet. The price, a flower. A cat that had taken up residence in the boarding house where she lived. The color of the sunset over the hills. "Nothing is going to happen," I said, which was a lie. And we both knew it was a lie, and the knowing did not make it less necessary. "Promise me." "I promise." He nodded and closed his eyes and was asleep almost immediately, the way the sick sleep, suddenly, completely, as if someone had turned off a lamp. I sat there for a long time, watching the flares and listening to the guns and thinking about 300 yards of open ground. Dawn came the way it came in the Levant in winter, slowly, reluctantly, a gray lightening of the eastern sky that crept across no man's land like a stain spreading through cloth. The bombardment began at 5:30. It was, I will admit, impressive. The siege batteries of New Antioch were among the most powerful weapons in the arsenal of the faithful, and when they fired in concentration, the effect was absolute. A wall of sound and fury that obliterated the heretic forward positions in a continuous eruption of earth and fire. The ground shook. The trench walls shuddered. Dust and debris rained from the parapet. For 15 minutes the world was nothing but noise, a sustained roar that bypassed the ears entirely and entered the body through the bones, the teeth, the organs. I felt my heart stutter in my chest with each impact and wondered if this was what it was like to be inside a bell when it was struck. The men of the section stood ready, fixed bayonets, full ammunition, grenades in the belt pouches, gas masks hanging at the chest. I stood beside Dunne on the fire step, my rifle in my hands, and tried to remember how to breathe. Nadia was on my left, her face as blank as a wall, her rifle held in a way that suggested she had been born with it. Luca was behind me, upright, pale, his jaw set with a determination that was either courage or fever stubbornness, and at that point, the distinction was academic. The bombardment stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was a held breath, a pause between the lightning and the thunder. I could hear my own pulse in my ears and the whistle of wind across the parapet, and somewhere to my right, very clearly, a man saying the Lord's Prayer in French. The whistle blew. Dunne went first. He pulled himself over the parapet with the fluid motion of a man who had done this 7 times before and vaulted the sandbags and was gone. I followed. My hands found the sandbag wall, and I hauled myself up and over, and for one terrible instant I was above the trench, above the parapet, fully exposed, the whole of my body offered to whatever was waiting on the other side. And then I was over, and falling forward, and my boots hit the ground of no man's land. And I ran. The first 30 yards were surreal in their silence. The bombardment had shattered the forward area into a moonscape of craters and upturned earth. And the heretic trench line was hidden behind a curtain of smoke and dust. I ran through this landscape with my rifle at my port and my eyes on Dunne's back ahead of me, and I felt nothing, no fear, no excitement, no thought at all. The mind had shut down. What was left was the body, and the body knew only one instruction: forward. The machine guns opened up at 40 yards. The silence held. They came from the flanks, from positions that the bombardment had not touched, pyramid-shaped pillboxes set into the heretic's second line, their firing slits angled to cover exactly the ground we were crossing. The sound of them was a tearing, ripping noise that I felt in my stomach before I heard it with my ears. It was not the sound of individual shots. It was a continuous ripping, as if the air itself were being torn into strips, and where the strips fell, men dropped. The man to my right, Private Henkel, a baker from Innsbruck who had arrived 3 weeks ago and whose name I had only learned yesterday, went down as if his legs had been cut from under him. He sat in the mud with his hands on his thigh and looked at the place where his knee had been with an expression of academic curiosity. And then another burst hit him in the chest, and he fell back and was still. Another man fell forward, face first, into the mud, and did not move. A third was thrown sideways by an impact I did not see, spinning like a top, his rifle flying from his hands, and he landed in a crater and began to scream in a register that I did not know the human voice could reach. Geysers of dirt erupted around me as the bullets chewed the ground, and I was no longer running in silence, but running in chaos, a world of noise and flying earth, and the zip and crack of rounds passing close enough to feel their wind. "Move!" Dunne's voice ahead of me, impossibly calm. "Keep moving!" I ran. I vaulted a crater and nearly landed on a man who was lying in the bottom of it with his hands pressed to his stomach and a look of surprise on his face that would have been comical in any other context. I kept running. The wire was ahead. I could see it now, a tangle of rusted barbs strung between iron stakes, and beyond it, the lip of the heretic trench. The bombardment had cut some of the wire, torn gaps in it, but the gaps were narrow and the wire on either side was intact and hung with things I tried not to look at. Dunne found a gap. He went through it sideways, turning his body to slip between the strands, and I followed, and a barb caught my sleeve and tore the fabric and the skin beneath it, and I barely felt it. Behind me, Nadia came through with the precision of a woman threading a needle. Luca came last, stumbling, and a strand of wire caught him across the thigh, and he cried out and pulled free and left a strip of trouser cloth and a smear of blood on the barbs. The heretic trench was 10 yards away. I could see the edge of it, the parapet of sandbags and timber, the dark slit of the trench itself. I expected fire from it. I expected to die in those last 10 yards, caught between the wire and the trench in the killing ground that every soldier knew was the worst place on earth. 10 yards, at a run, perhaps 3 seconds. 3 seconds in which a heretic rifleman could sight, aim, and fire twice if he was competent, and 3 times if he was exceptional. And the heretic legionnaires were men who had walked to the gate of hell, which suggested a certain baseline of competence. But the fire did not come. The trench was silent. The bombardment had done its work, or the defenders had pulled back, or something else was happening that I did not have time to consider. I reached the parapet and threw myself over it. The drop was 6 feet, and I landed badly, my ankle turning on something in the dark, and I went down on one knee in mud that was thicker and darker than the mud in our own trench. The smell hit me before I could see what I had landed in. A reek of sulfur and rotting meat and something else, something chemical and wrong, a smell that seemed to have a color, a greasy yellow-green that coated the back of my throat. Dunne landed beside me, then Nadia, then Luca, who fell and did not get up immediately, and I grabbed his arm and pulled him upright. "On your feet." I'm up. I'm up. The silence held. The heretic trench was a mirror of our own, but wrong. The geometry was the same: fire bay, traverse, communication trench. But everything about it was subtly, deeply wrong in ways that took a moment to register. The sandbags were marked with symbols I did not recognize. Angular and sharp, burnt into the Hessian. The timber supports were darker than they should have been, stained with something that was not creosote. The duckboards were iron instead of wood, and they were warm to the touch. Warm in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature, a residual heat that seemed to come from below, from the earth itself. Bodies lay in the trench, heretic legionnaires. Their uniforms were dark, stained with the chemical residue of the bombardment, and their skin, what I could see of it, was marked with the brands and scars that were the hallmarks of their pilgrimage. Men who had walked to the gate of hell and survived. Men whose flesh bore the maker's marks of their damnation as proudly as a craftsman's stamp on a finished piece. One of them was still alive, crawling along the trench floor with his legs shattered, dragging himself forward with hands that left streaks of dark blood on the iron duckboards. Dunne put a bullet through the back of his head without breaking stride, and we moved on. We were in the heretic trench. We had made it across, but the section was smaller now. I counted 8 of us, where there had been 30 at the start. 22 men lost in 300 yards. I did not know how many were dead and how many were wounded and lying in the craters of no man's land waiting for stretcher-bearers who might or might not come. The mathematics of the assault: 22 men for a stretch of trench that smelled like the inside of a coffin. "Consolidate," said Dunne. "Check your ammunition. Get on the parapet and watch the approaches. They'll counterattack. They always do." We spread along the captured section. Nadia found a firing position on the parapet facing the heretic rear lines and set up with her rifle. I took the bay adjacent to hers. Luca sat against the trench wall, breathing hard, his face a shade of gray that I associated with the dead rather than the living. I gave him water. He drank it. He did not cough for the first time in hours, and this worried me more than the coughing had, because it suggested that whatever was wrong with him had moved past the stage where the body protests and into the stage where it conserves. "Luca, I am fine. Stop saying that." He looked at me, and for a moment the fever brightness in his eyes cleared, and I saw the boy behind it. The 19-year-old from Naples who missed his mother and his girl and the son, and who had been put in a trench by men who did not know his name, and sent across open ground by men who would not remember it. "I am scared, Thomas." "Good. Scared men live longer." Dunne said that? Dunne says a lot of things. The counterattack came an hour later. It came not from the direction we expected. Not from the heretic rear lines where Nadia was watching, but from the communication trench to our left, a flanking move that put them in our section before we knew they were coming. The first sign was a grenade, a heretic frag that sailed over the traverse and landed in the bay where 2 men from Section 14 were sheltering. The explosion was flat and sharp, and the screaming that followed was short. Then, they were on us. Heretic legionnaires moving fast through their own trench with the familiarity of men who had built it, firing as they came. The noise was instantaneous and total. Rifles, grenades, the shriek of bullets off the iron duckboards, the deeper bark of a machine pistol. A heretic came around the traverse into our bay, and Dunne shot him in the chest, and he went back the way he had come. And another came, and Nadia shot him through the eye, and a third came, and a fourth, and the trench was a corridor of smoke and muzzle flash, and the intimate horror of men killing each other at a distance measured in feet. I shot a man who was trying to throw a grenade. He fell, and the grenade fell with him, and I ducked behind the traverse as the blast blew fragments of iron and flesh over my head. My ears rang. My hands were shaking, but the rifle was steady because the rifle was the continuation, and the hands knew what to do with it even when the mind had stopped giving instructions. The silence held. We held. We held. Because there was nowhere to retreat to, and because the alternative to holding was dying, and because Seamus Dunne was the kind of soldier who held things together by the sheer force of his refusal to fall apart. He moved along the section, firing, reloading, dragging wounded men behind traverses, shouting orders in a voice that cut through the noise like a blade. Then the heretics pulled back. Not a retreat, a withdrawal, orderly and deliberate, pulling out of the communication trench and back toward their secondary line. I leaned against the trench wall and breathed and tried to count the living. Dunne, Nadia, Luca still sitting where I had left him, his rifle across his knees, his eyes closed. 3 others from different sections. 8 had entered the trench. 6 remained. "They're not done," said Dunne. He was right. I could hear it. A sound from beyond the heretic rear lines. A low, sustained note that was not artillery and not engines and not the wind. It was a howl, but not a human howl. Deeper, wider, a sound that seemed to come from the ground itself, vibrating through the iron duckboards and up through my boots and into my bones. It was the sound of something large and angry moving through the heretic trench system toward us, and I knew what it was before my mind formed the word. "Warwolf," said Nadia. She said it the way she said everything. Flat, factual, without embellishment. But I saw her hands move on her rifle, adjusting her grip, and I saw her jaw tighten, and I understood that even Nadia Orloff, who feared nothing I had ever seen, was afraid. "Into the dugout," said Dunne. "Everyone into the dugout, now." The heretic dugout was deeper than ours, cut into the earth at a steep angle, descending perhaps 15 feet below the trench floor. The entrance was reinforced with iron beams, stamped with those same angular symbols, and the walls were lined with something that might have been stone, but was warm and faintly vibrating, like the wall of a living thing. We crowded into the space, 6 of us in a hole, built for 10, and Dunne positioned himself at the entrance with a grenade in each hand. The sound grew louder. The howl had resolved into something more specific, a rhythmic, rasping sound, like an engine running on damaged cylinders, interspersed with the screech and grind of metal on metal. I realized what I was hearing. The chainsaw mouth. The warwolf's jaws, those hell-forged teeth that were designed to cut through miles of barbed wire, running at idle as the beast moved through the trench. Then the ground shook, not the distant tremor of artillery, a close, immediate impact as if something enormous had dropped into the trench directly above us. Dirt fell from the dugout ceiling. The iron beams groaned, A second impact, a third, footsteps, but footsteps that carried the weight of something far beyond human, heavy, deliberate, each one a concussion that I felt in my chest cavity. Through the dugout entrance I could see a slice of the trench above, the wall, the sky, a section of parapet. A shadow fell across this view, and in the shadow was a shape. I had seen drawings of werewolves in the intelligence briefings. I had seen photographs, grainy and indistinct, taken at range by forward observers. None of it had prepared me for the reality. The thing that moved past the dugout entrance was armored in plates of black iron that bore the maker's stamps of Hell's factories, symbols pressed into the metal by hands that were not human, in forges that burned with fires that were not of this world. The armor covered a body that was roughly canine in shape, but wrong in its proportions. Too large, too dense, the limbs too thick, and the head too long, tapering to a snout that was not a snout, but a mechanism, rows of interlocking blades that moved in a continuous cycle, chewing the air, the sound of them a grinding, shrieking whine that set my teeth on edge and made my eyes water. The claws were worse than the mouth. They were longer than my forearm, curved and segmented, and they flexed as the beast moved with a mechanical fluidity that was neither animal nor machine, but something between, something that the factories of hell had assembled from parts that should not have been assembled and animated with a purpose that had nothing to do with life. It stopped. The silence held. It stopped directly above the dugout entrance, and I heard it breathing, not the breathing of lungs, but the cycling of some internal mechanism, a bellows sound, in and out, in and out. Its head swung down, and I saw the eye. One eye, red-orange, set deep in the armored skull, glowing with a light that was not reflected but generated, an internal fire that illuminated the trench wall with a hellish amber glow. No one breathed. 6 people in a hole in the ground, and not one of us drew breath. I was aware of the man beside me, one of the survivors from Section 14, a corporal whose name I did not know, pressing himself against the wall with such force that the warm stone must have bruised his spine. Nadia had her rifle raised, the muzzle pointed at the entrance, her hands steady as granite. Dunne held the grenades the way a priest holds a chalice, with absolute certainty of purpose. The eye scanned the trench, passing across the dugout entrance, and for one endless moment I was certain it was looking directly at me, that it could see through the dark and the earth and the iron beams to where I sat with my useless rifle and my useless bayonet and my heart beating so hard I was sure the beast could hear it. Time stopped, or became something other than time, a substance, thick and viscous, that I was trapped in the way an insect is trapped in amber. Luca coughed. A single, involuntary bark of sound, muffled by the hand he clamped over his mouth. But in the silence of the dugout, it was as loud as a gunshot. The werewolf's head snapped toward the entrance, the eye blazed. The chainsaw mouth revved to full speed, the sound filling the world, and the beast's snout thrust into the dugout entrance, the blades of its mouth chewing through the iron beam like paper, spraying fragments of metal and earth into the dugout. Dunne threw the grenade. He threw it not at the beast, but past it, over it, into the trench behind, and the explosion drew the werewolf's attention for the fraction of a second it took Dunne to throw the second grenade directly into the mechanism of its mouth. The blast was muffled by the beast's own armor, contained within the structure of its jaw, and the effect was immediate and catastrophic. The chainsaw mechanism seized, teeth-shattering components flying free, and the werewolf reared back with a sound that was not a howl, but a scream, a mechanical shriek of damaged systems and something beneath the machinery that might have been pain. "Out! Out! Now!" Dunne was moving, pushing us past him, up the dugout steps and into the trench. The war wolf was 5 yards away, shaking its head, its jaw hanging at an angle, the blade still trying to cycle but catching and grinding on the damaged mechanism. Blood. If it was blood. If the black fluid that leaked from the shattered mouth could be called blood, spattered the trench walls. We ran. We ran through the heretic trench the way we had run across no man's land. Without thought, without direction, simply away. Behind us, the war wolf recovered itself, the grinding of its jaw settling into a new rhythm, damaged but functional, and I heard it coming, the heavy footfalls, the scrape of those terrible claws on the iron duckboards, closer and closer. The trench was not designed for running. It zigzagged in the standard defensive pattern, each traverse a blind corner that you took at full speed with no knowledge of what was on the other side. We passed the body of a heretic legionnaire who had been crushed against the trench wall by the war wolf's passage, his body pressed into the earth like a stamp pressed into wax. We passed a section where the beast's claws had torn the trench wall open, exposing the dark earth beyond and the pale roots of something growing in the corrupted soil that seemed to reach toward us as we passed. Nadia stopped. She stopped and turned and dropped to one knee and brought her rifle up and fired. The shot hit the war wolf in the eye. The eye, that red-orange furnace set deep in its skull, shattered, the light going out like a lamp being extinguished, and the beast staggered, its charge faltering, one massive claw raking the trench wall and tearing out a section of sandbag and timber. It did not fall. A war wolf does not fall from a single wound, even a wound like that. But it slowed, and in the seconds that its confusion bought us, we ran. The silence held. We ran until the heretic trench intersected with a communication trench that led back toward our lines, back toward the drain, back toward something that was not the howling darkness behind us. The communication trench was narrow and shallow and offered no protection beyond the fact that it led away, and we took it, all 6 of us, stumbling and sliding in the mud, and behind us, the war wolf followed. It was Luca who fell. Of course it was Luca. His legs gave out at a junction where the communication trench branched, and he went down hard, face first into the mud, and did not get up. I turned back for him. Dunne shouted something, my name probably, or an order to keep moving, but I turned back because I had promised him I would send his letters. And a man who turns his back on a promise is not a man worth the 300 yards it took to get here. I grabbed Luca's arm and pulled. He was lighter than he should have been. The fever had eaten him from the inside, burned through whatever reserves he had, and what I was lifting was a shell of wool and bone, and not much else. I got him over my shoulder and I ran, and behind me I heard the war wolf hit the junction, heard its remaining eye scan the branching paths, heard it choose, and it chose wrong. It went left where we had gone right, and the sound of it receded, and we kept running until the communication trench ended at a section of our own wire. And I saw through the tangle of barbs and stakes the parapet of the drain. "Friendly! Friendly coming in!" Dunne's voice, hoarse, cracked, but carrying the authority of a man who would not be shot by his own side through simple failure of communication. Hands reached down and pulled us over the parapet. I landed in our trench, in our mud, with Luca still over my shoulder, and the smell of the drain, our latrine, our dead, our particular variety of rot, was the sweetest thing I had ever smelled, because it was ours. I set Luca down on the fire step. His eyes were closed. His breathing was shallow and fast. I pressed my fingers to his throat and felt the pulse. Rapid, weak, but present. The fever burned through his skin like a stove. "Stretcher," I said. "We need a stretcher." Dunne sat on the fire step opposite and put his head in his hands. I had never seen him do this. In 14 months, I had never seen Seamus Dunne display any gesture that could be interpreted as exhaustion or despair, or the acknowledgement that what he had just done was not, in fact, something a man could simply do and then move on from. He sat there for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he lifted his head, and his face was his face again, weathered, creased, the eyes hard and clear. "Well," he said, "that was bracing." Nadia sat beside me on the fire step, her rifle across her knees, and she was shaking. Not much. A fine tremor in her hands that someone less familiar with her would not have noticed. I noticed it because I had never seen Nadia's hands shake before. Not even when she was firing at targets that were firing back. And the sight of it frightened me more than the war wolf had. "You shot it in the eye," I said. "I shot it in the eye, from a kneeling position, while it was charging." It was a large target. "You are the most terrifying person I have ever met." "Thank you, Thomas." The stretcher-bearers came. They took Luca to the aid station. I watched them carry him down the communication trench, his arm hanging limply off the side of the stretcher, the packet of letters from Vittoria visible in his unbuttoned breast pocket. I thought about the girl in the supply town writing about flower prices and cats and sunsets, and I felt something crack in my chest that had nothing to do with the bruises. Sergeant Horvat came down the trench an hour later. His face was the face he wore when he had received orders he did not like, which was the same face he always wore. "Casualty report." Dunne gave it. Of the 30 men who had gone over the top from our section of trench, 6 had returned. 7 others were confirmed wounded in no man's land and being recovered by stretcher parties. The remaining 17 were dead or unaccounted for. Of the 8 who had entered the heretic trench, 6 had come back. "The Warwolf," said Horvat. "Still in the heretic trench system last we saw. Damaged, but functional. It took a grenade in the mouth and a rifle round through the eye, and it was still moving when we left." The silence held. Horvat wrote this down. "Battalion will want a full report." "Battalion can come and get one," said Dunne. "Anytime they like. I'll leave the kettle on." Horvat did not respond to this. He moved on. The day ground forward. More survivors trickled back from no man's land. Wounded men who'd crawled the 300 yards back under their own power. Some of them dragging shattered limbs behind them, all of them wearing the look of men who had been somewhere they could not describe, and had come back to a place that no longer felt real. The aid station in the reserve trench was overwhelmed. The stretcher-bearers, sisters of St. Cosmas, most of them, women who moved through the trench system with a calm efficiency that shamed the rest of us, worked without rest, carrying wounded to the rear, returning for more. By midday, the full scope of the assault became clear through the reports that filtered down the line. The 1st Battalion attacking on our left had been stopped at the wire. The 2nd Battalion on our right had reached the heretic trench but had been pushed back by a counterattack that included anointed heavy infantry in their Gehenna armor. Men whose flesh still burned from their pilgrimage to hell, and who fought with the strength and fury of the damned they had chosen to become. The combined casualties of the 3 battalions were somewhere north of 400. The heretic trench line was back in heretic hands. 300 yards of no man's land had been crossed and recrossed, and the line on the map had not moved. I sat in the trench and stared at the wall and tried to think about nothing. This was a skill I had developed over 14 months, the ability to empty the mind the way you empty a bucket, tip it over and let everything run out and sit with the hollow that remains. It did not always work. Today, it did not work. The images kept coming. The wire, the bodies, the war-wolf's eye, the sound of its mouth, Luca falling. I could not stop them, and I did not try. Dunne brought tea. We sat together on the fire step and drank it and said nothing for a long time. Seamus, Thomas, why did the heretics pull their infantry back before the counterattack? They could have held us in the trench and brought the war-wolf in behind us. We would have been trapped. Dunne looked at me over the rim of his cup. That is a good question. They withdrew deliberately. They gave us the trench. Then they sent the war-wolf. Why would they do that? Because they wanted us in that trench when the beast came. Because they wanted the war-wolf committed to that sector. I did not understand. Dunne saw that I did not understand, and he sighed, and he set down his cup. Think about it, Thomas. We received intelligence 2 days ago that a war-wolf was in Sector 7. We reported this up the chain. Battalion knew, brigade knew, Colonel Brandt knew, and Colonel Brandt ordered us to attack Sector 7 anyway, 300 yards across open ground against a position defended by an assault beast. Because he's a fool. Brandt is many things. A fool is not one of them. Dunne paused. Before I came to this company, I served under a brigadier who had a saying, "The purpose of an order is not always the purpose stated in the order." Brandt did not send us to take Trench Kappa 3. He sent us to pull the war-wolf into Sector 7. Pull it toward us? Think about what a war-wolf does. It charges. It commits. It goes where the fighting is because that is what it was built to do. If the heretics had a war-wolf in this part of the line, it was there for a reason, to support a counter-offensive maybe, or to punch through our wire somewhere that mattered. If that beast was committed here, against us, against a company of yeomen on a secondary trench line that is worth nothing, then it was not somewhere else. The understanding arrived slowly, the way dawn arrives, not all at once, but in stages, each one a little brighter and a little worse. We were bait. We were bait. 24 men dead. For bait. 24 men dead so that the war-wolf would be here, and not at whatever section of the line it was actually meant to hit. That is the arithmetic, Thomas. That is what Brandt's order was for. The silence held. I sat with this knowledge the way I had sat with all the other knowledge the war had given me, the knowledge of what men look like when they die badly, the knowledge of what mud smells like when it contains the dead, the knowledge that the leaders who sent you forward did not always send you forward because they believed you could succeed. Sometimes they sent you forward because they needed you to fail, and your failure served a purpose that you would never be told about, and the purpose was worth more than your life, because everything was worth more than your life. I thought about Colonel Brandt standing in our trench with his photographer, looking at Luca's gray face and saying, "Fine, fine work." I wondered if he had known then. I wondered if the photograph, the colonel at the front, sharing the hardship of his men, had been taken to establish his presence at the forward line before the assault, so that the after-action report would show that he had personally inspected the troops before sending them to die. I wondered if the church observer who had accompanied him had been there to ensure that the order was carried out, that the bait was properly set. I didn't say any of this. There was nothing to say. The war was what it was. The drain was what it was. We were what we were, Yeoman of the 11th Antioch Line Infantry, alive through Luck and Dunne's grenades and Nadia's eye. And the fact that a werewolf had turned left instead of right at a junction in a communication trench. 24 men had bought us that luck with their lives, and they had not known they were buying it. And no one would tell their families what the purchase had been for. Nadia came back from the parapet. Movement in no man's land. I looked through the periscope. Stretcher parties, mostly. Our own men retrieving wounded from the craters. But beyond them, in the heretic lines, I could see figures moving. Heretic legionnaires reoccupying the trench we had taken and abandoned. They moved with the unhurried efficiency of men who had expected this, who had known that the trench would be returned to them because the assault had never been about the trench. Among them, at the edge of visibility, I saw the werewolf. It stood in the heretic trench like a monument, its damaged jaw hanging at its broken angle, the empty socket where its eye had been turned toward our lines. Even at this distance, even through the scratched lens of the periscope, it was the most frightening thing I had ever seen. Not because of its size or its armor or its weapons, but because of its patience. It stood and it waited and it watched with its one remaining eye, and I understood that it would remember. The factories of hell did not build things that forgot. I turned from the periscope and sat down on the fire step. The day was ending. The light was failing. The guns of New Antioch fired their evening salvo, and the ground shook and dust fell from the trench walls. Somewhere behind me, in the aid station, Luca was either recovering or dying, and I would not know which until tomorrow. Somewhere in the heretic lines, a monster was remembering us. Somewhere in a headquarters 20 miles behind the front, Colonel Brandt was writing his report. And the report would say that the assault on Trench Kappa 3 had achieved its strategic objectives, and this would be true in a way that made truth feel like another kind of lie. Word came up the line from the aid station at dusk. Luca was alive. The fever had broken. The Sisters of St. Cosmas had done whatever it was they did. Prayer and medicine and the particular ruthless competence that their order was known for. And the boy from Naples was going to live. Dunne received this news, nodded once, and said, "Good. He owes me 12 ducats from a card game in September, and I'll not have him dying before he pays." I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed since yesterday, and the sound surprised me. A short, hard bark that came from somewhere below the chest, from the place where the body stores the things the mind cannot process. Dunne smiled, which was a rare event, the kind of thing you noted the way you noted a sunset or a warm day in the drain, briefly, because it would not last. The silence held. I ate my rations. The stew was cold and tasted of tin, and the bread was 3 days old. It was the best meal I had ever had. I ate it sitting on the fire step of Trench Sigma 9, the drain, the worst place I had ever lived, and I was grateful for every mouthful because I was alive to taste it. The night came. The flares went up. The guns rumbled. The lice bit. The rats came out and investigated Dunne's snare and avoided it with the intelligence of creatures that had been outwitting men since before the gate of hell had opened. I lay on the fire step with my greatcoat pulled over me and my rifle beside me, and I thought about the things that the day had contained. The assault, the trench, the werewolf, the knowledge of what we had been used for. And I found that I could hold all of it at once, without breaking. This was what the war taught you, if it did not kill you first. It taught you the capacity of the human mind to contain things that should not be containable. To hold horror and humor in the same hand. To watch 24 men die for a purpose they were not told about, and then to eat stew and laugh at a joke about a card debt, and feel the lice crawling on your skin, and to know, with absolute certainty, that you would do it again tomorrow if ordered, because the alternative was not doing it, and the alternative was worse. I pulled the letter from my pocket, the one I had written to no one, about rain and walnut cake and a girl named Eva. I held it for a moment in the dark, feeling the paper between my fingers. Then I tore it up and dropped the pieces into the mud at my feet. I would write another one tomorrow. A man who writes letters to no one is a man who expects to survive long enough to write more, and in the drain, in this stretch of mud and misery on the Levant front within sight of the walls of New Antioch, expectation was the closest thing we had to hope. The bells of New Antioch, carried faintly on the wind from 20 miles behind us, marked midnight. The guns answered them, as they always did, as they had for 300 years. I closed my eyes and listened to the war breathing around me, and I slept. The silence held.